The regulators didn't catch it. There's been a lot of talk about Silicon Valley Bank wasn't being regulated because of a bill passed back in 2018 or 2019. That's not true.
Yeah, a great speech by Republican Senator John Kennedy. He forgot to mention that he voted to deregulate mid-sized banks like Silicon Valley Bank in 2018. The oversight he's about to cite is complete BS, and he knows it.
Silicon Valley Bank was heavily regulated. It had to file regular reports with the federal banking regulators. It was subject to stress testing. It was subject to liquidity stress testing. All the regulators had to do was read the reports that the Silicon Valley Bank was submitting, and they would have seen the problem.
I'm going to explain exactly why what you just heard from Republican Senator John Kennedy is complete and utter nonsense. This idea that it was so heavily regulated and there was nothing else that could have been done. Obviously, he wants to provide cover for the fact that he was one of the many Republican lawmakers who voted to deregulate the bank, or mid-sized banks, I should say, back in 2018. But I also want to be fair and reiterate that there were Democrats who voted in favor of that deregulation as well, as many as 17 Democrats to be specific. Now, what did they do? Just as a refresher, let's go back to 2018 and discuss what the deregulation accomplished. The Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Bill Congress passed after the 2008 financial crisis imposed special oversight rules on banks with more than $50 billion in assets. That was good. But 10 years later in 2018, at the behest of the regional banking industry, meaning after taking bribes from the regional banking industry, the bipartisan bank bill raised the threshold for those prudential standards so that they were only mandatory for banks with $250 billion in assets or more. Okay, so essentially the deregulations that were in place that would have impacted, and for a short period of time did impact, Silicon Valley Bank were then repealed for mid-sized banks like Silicon Valley Bank. Now let me be clear in just noting that the deregulation on its own is very likely one of the factors for why this bank collapsed. I'm not saying it's the only factor, but it's certainly one of the factors. And that's not based on my expertise, that's based on the expertise of economists, which we'll get to in just a moment. But Congress at the time, back in 2018, as they were considering this deregulation, was warned that it would be a terrible idea. The Congressional Budget Office, for instance, specifically warned that the bill increased the risk that a mid-sized financial institution would fail. And that is what happened in the case of Silicon Valley Bank. Now, Republicans argue that they can essentially neglect their jobs. You know, they could take the bribes from the financial industry, they could take the bribes from mid-sized banks, they could do the bidding of mid-sized banks, in this case particularly, as long as they get the funding, the campaign funding that they so desperately want and desire. And then they can essentially neglect their duty as individuals who are elected to protect the American people, individuals who are elected to ensure that banks don't do incredibly risky maneuvers with depositor money. You know, they're just supposed to protect the American people from corporations and banks that seek to do one thing and one thing only, to maximize their profits. But lawmakers who voted for this deregulation didn't want to do that, and instead said, instead of us codifying this regulation and applying it to mid-sized banks, we're just gonna have the Federal Reserve deal with it. You know, the body of unelected officials, we're just gonna have them, you know, if they want, they could take a look at what these mid-sized banks are doing, and if they find any type of issue, then they can deal with it. Except we didn't elect the Federal Reserve to do that. We elected congressional lawmakers to provide oversight into corporations, into the banking system. And they failed to do that because they were paid to avoid doing their jobs. They were paid to ensure that they deregulated mid-sized banks, and that is a problem. Now, there are other issues here. Now, I want to just give you a little sense of what they're saying about the Federal Reserve's responsibility here. Republicans focused on the fact that the bill still allowed regulators like the Federal Reserve to impose stricter standards on institutions with less than $250 billion in assets if they thought it would be a good idea. So when Senator Kennedy argues like, I don't know what they're saying. They are regulated. No, they're not though. They're not regulated. You're essentially offloading, outsourcing your responsibility to the Federal Reserve. But here's the funny thing. They knew where the Federal Reserve stood on this issue, meaning they knew full well that the Federal Reserve was gonna have a complete hands-off approach. In fact, at the time, back in 2018, Jerome Powell and Randy Quayles, the chairman and former top bank regulator at the Federal Reserve, told lawmakers during hearings on the legislation in 2018 that it would be a good idea to cut regional banks some slack. Cut them some slack, too many regulations, let them go wild. Is that the regulation that you were referring to, Senator Kennedy? I mean, how pathetic is this? Now, Senator Mike Rounds, who was one of the other Republican lawmakers who voted in favor of the deregulation, has no regrets. In fact, he says this: they, meaning the Federal Reserve, had the tools available. The question is, why didn't they use the tools? No, Mike Rounds, the question is, when the Federal Reserve made it clear that they had no interest in pursuing regulation of these mid-sized banks, why did you think that they would? By the way, Mike Rounds, of course, takes money from the investment and securities industry, much like every other lawmaker that I'm going to reference in this story. Let's go to Senator Thom Tillis, another Republican. He says this: it was an option, meaning the Federal Reserve overseeing what the bank was up to. And if they choose not to do it, it's gonna be a really good question based on the activities of Silicon Valley. They're just gonna, again, outsource this to the Federal Reserve, which made it clear that they had no interest in doing oversight of these mid-sized banks. Let me continue. Thom Tillis, by the way, received more than, it's a lot of money, $1.95 million in donations from the securities and investment industry between 2017 and 2022 in that short period of time. Could it be that that money made a little bit of a difference in how Senator Tillis feels about regulations toward the banking industry? Could it be? I don't know, I'm just asking questions. The Federal Reserve has said that it will conduct an investigation of its oversight of the bank and produce a report by May, by the way, by May, when maybe all of us have already forgotten about this story and maybe they don't release any report at all, we'll see. But Senator Mike Crapo argues that the deregulation had nothing to do with SVB going belly up. The fact is, this is not a capital issue. This is a liquidity issue. It's an entirely different set of issues. Is it, Mr. Crapo? Because fact of the matter is, well, let me back up actually. What ended up happening was Silicon Valley Bank had invested the bulk of its depositor money into government bonds. When all of these depositors who were now dealing with a rough economic situation as a result of high interest rates wanted to start withdrawing some money, all of a sudden you have this mid-sized bank having a little bit of difficulty in providing the funds to fulfill those withdrawals. They had to sell the government bonds, but they had to sell those bonds at a loss because as the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, the value of those government bonds go down. So they took a loss of 1.8 million as they decided to cash out those government bonds in order to, fulfill the depositor needs as they were withdrawing money. Okay, now here's the interesting part. Here's what actually I didn't even know until fairly recently. I looked into what is considered liquid assets by the Federal Reserve. Examples of liquid assets generally include central bank reserves and government bonds. So government bonds account for the liquidity of the bank. So if you have the regulation in place, and the regulation Yes, it included provisions that ensured that there was enough liquidity in the banks to deal with, an economic downturn should the depositors want to withdraw money. But the other provisions included stress tests, and the stress tests ensure that there isn't mismanagement of that money. Meaning, if you see a situation in which interest rates are going to go up and the value of those government bonds are going to go down, well, regulators would look into what SVB was up to and say, yo, you got to diversify. You can't, you're going to lose the value of these assets as a result of the Federal Reserve raising interest rates. But there was no watchdog involved because of the deregulation. So again, I'm not saying it's the only reason why Silicon Valley Bank collapsed, but the deregulation was certainly a factor. And how are you going to consider government bonds liquid when, honestly, in some ways, it's much more complicated than that? If you know the value of that asset can go down significantly as a result of interest rates, that needs to be taken into account as well. Now, according to the Federal Reserve, all that money that Silicon Valley Bank had invested in government bonds, which lost value as the Fed increased the rates, was liquid. I just want to reiterate that. And by the way, it's not strange at all that Crapo, much like Tillis, much like Mike Rounds, would provide a cover for the sick ideology that allows banks to essentially get away with mismanagement and activities that really do put ordinary people at risk. So Crapo received more than $880,000 in donations from the securities and investment industry between 2017 and 2022. What would have happened if regulators actually kept a close eye on mid-sized banks like Silicon Valley Bank? Well, according to an economist and the director of the Roosevelt Institute, SVB would have had to report it to regulators monthly, and the signs would have been caught earlier. According to the experts, deregulation certainly played a role. And while these lawmakers, both Democrats and Republicans, want to make us all think they did nothing wrong, they did the right thing, and then we should immediately focus on woke ideology and how that allegedly contributed to the downfall of this bank. Fact of the matter is, what they really want to do is hide the fact that they work for their donors as opposed to the American people. That's the real story here. I want to correct what I said. When SVB cashed out those government bonds, they did it at a loss of 1.8 billion, not million, billion. Okay, so I misspoke. I apologize for that. I just want to make sure that I clarified that and didn't give you any misinformation.
Thanks for watching the Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.